Hello and welcome to History by Hollywood, a podcast series examining the real events and people behind fact-based movies. This is episode 29 for Sunday the 22nd of April 2018, and today's movie is Steven Spielberg's Lincoln, released in 2012, starring Daniel Day-Lewis in the title role, supported by Sally Field as his wife Mary. My name is Martin Darlington, and with me as ever is Andrew Blischczyk. Hello, Andrew.
Hello, Martin. Hello, everyone. History by Hollywood is now available on podcast distribution site Stitcher. A link has been added to the links page of our website, www.historybyhollywood.com, where you can also find links to iTunes. This link actually appears on every page on the website, plus SoundCloud, Podbean, YouTube, and for Android subscriptions. Some listener feedback. Listener and host of the Doctor Who podcast, Rob Irwin, appears to have settled the tombstone debate over Huckleberry versus Hucklebearer. Val Kilmer, apparently, he signed some artwork that you can see on his website with the words, "I'm your Huckleberry." So that would appear to be game, set and match. Good debate, though.
Yeah, Gary Shavit wrote following up his pre-Evita email with his post-Evita email, and amongst what he wrote, he said, hello Martin and Andrew, I wrote about watching Evita again, having been dragged to the theatre the first time by his ex-wife who was born in Argentina. He did say her family weren't vocally pro or anti-Peronist, but they did emigrate to Chile after his first term for economic reasons. Said, as to the movie itself and your podcast, totally agree it would have been greatly improved by some more non-musical dialogue, but in all he felt we did a great job. He's looking forward to watching Lincoln again, and In the Heart of the Sea flew under his radar completely, as it did ours really. He's flying to Portugal for vacation shortly, so in fact I think he'll be on his way by now. So he'll be doing his homework on the planes and in the airports. Regards, Gary. He's a very good student listener, Gary. He does homework, he researches it.
Yeah, thanks for your enthusiasm, Gary. We've got a new listener, Jonathan Stomas, who wrote on our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/History by Hollywood, all one word. Jonathan says, hello, I just started listening to your podcast and I love it. I've listened to the Gladiator and Rush episodes and I love it. I love history and learning about history, and I love history movies. I would love an episode on Kingdom of Heaven, Troy, or Braveheart. And if you ever cover TV series, Rome and the Tudors would be great. Thanks for the podcast, it's amazing. Well, Jonathan, thank you very much for your enthusiastic support. And as we replied previously, Braveheart is a definite. Troy, almost certainly not, due to the mythological nature of the original story. And Kingdom of Heaven, we need a bit more thought on that one, I think. As for our TV series, I suggest you listen to what's coming up next.
There we go. Well, looking forward, next time out on Sunday the 6th of May, we will, as mentioned before, doing In the Heart of the Sea, about the sinking of the whale ship Essex by a sperm whale. The episode after that, Andrew's away for a little period, so it's going to be a solo effort by Martin again, by me, and that's on Sunday the 20th of May, and that will be Supplementary 3, the TV special. After many requests to cover such series as Rome, Band of Brothers and Black Sails, I'll be doing an oversight view of these series. I'll try and remain as spoiler-free as possible, but really talking about what period they're portraying and how accurate they are without going into plot detail too much. I'll also have a look at Peaky Blinders, which is post-World War I Birmingham gang and crime drama. That's Birmingham, UK, not Alabama. Turn, which I found absolutely fascinating. It's about George Washington's cold perspiring during the War of Independence, and possibly one or two other TV series. I, Claudius is one I have seen. And as you can probably guess, these are based around the series that I've actually watched, or one of us has watched. We haven't seen the Tudors or the Borgias, both of which have been requested in the past, and don't really have time to do so before that episode, but we will address some of them. I mean, Rome and Black Sails and Band of Brothers have been the most requested, so we will do those. And just really, to if you guys and girls are enjoying the show, please do share it with your friends, colleagues, tennis partners, and anyone else you bump into. And whichever platform you use to listen, it does help tremendously to spread the word if you can just write a brief review or a long one, whichever you prefer. So,
on with the show.
On with the show. The movie opens with a fierce battle, Union and Confederate soldiers engaged in hand-to-hand combat for what was the Battle of Jenkins Ferry on April 30th, 1864. Then it shows two free black soldiers in Union uniform conversing with a seated President Lincoln during a cold, wet evening, presumably still at Jenkins Ferry. They're then joined by two nervous young white soldiers, and between them they start to begin a discussion about Lincoln's famous Gettysburg Address, which he delivered in November 1863, a couple of years after the war commenced. Both the white soldiers and then one of the black soldiers can recite the famous speech.
Okay, well, let's do our first reality check, and we'll do a bit of setting of the scene in this one too. By the time of the Battle of Jenkins Ferry, the war had been going for 3 years. Initially, not so well for Lincoln's Union Army. 2 years before the war, 7 of the 34 states broke away from the United States and formed the Confederacy, the Southern Confederacy. After much tension, civil war broke out in April of 1863 when the South attacked Fort Sumter in South Carolina. With some embarrassing losses by the North to the inferior numbers of the South, it looked like Lincoln would be a one-term president, having first been elected in November 1860. So after the initial disappointing battles for the North, Lincoln changed his leading generals to William Tecumseh Sherman and Ulysses S. Grant. Things started to then improve. Sherman took the city of Atlanta, Georgia, in September of 64. The public mood improved, and by November of 64, Lincoln was re-elected. So he was into his second term by the time this movie's taking place. The Battle of Jenkins Ferry is accurately portrayed in the movie. It was a wet, bloody and fierce affair. The references to the Gettysburg Address by all the soldiers are probably more for us as a modern audience. It does remain one of the best speeches in history. It did take a while for this to be realised, and it's probably unlikely that this cross-section of soldiers would have memorised it in 1863.
Yeah, I mean, some of the stuff I read, certainly I think his ability to people pick was quite extraordinary. And when he was elected, seen very much as an outsider, which I realise I don't really know much about him. I mean, he was a lawyer, self-taught or largely self-educated.
From a log cabin. He was born in Kentucky but made his name and mark and became a lawyer and ran for the Senate in Illinois. Yeah, so Illinois was his home. But
then when he got elected, one of the first things was the rival and the favourite for the Republican nomination as president. He brought him straight in as his right-hand man.
Even more than that, there were 4 people that were contenders for the primary for the very, very first Republican election. The Republican Party was brand new at this stage. I think they picked up stuff from the Whigs, whatever they represented.
Yeah, but they were the old British Liberals.
Right. And so somehow Lincoln came through the pack and surprised everybody, including himself, by winning the nomination. There were very, very strong candidates for the Republican Party. There were 3 others than Lincoln, and literally the first thing he did when he got elected to president was he appointed all 3 others to key positions in his cabinet. The only one that survived in those positions into this second term is, as you say, his Secretary of State, Seward, his right-hand man. The other 2 had bowed out. One had become, Chase was one of them. One had become a Supreme Court Justice because the relationship had soured a bit by then.
Right.
But that's the whole premise of the book, that is based on the team of rivals, that he surprised everybody.
Even on the way to Washington to take up his presidency, Pinkerton of the Pinkerton Agency, I can't remember his first name, Henry Pinkerton, I think.
Detective Agency?
Yeah. He warned him that there was an assassination plot, and to avoid a particular town, was it Birkdale, somewhere like that. So he, even then, he certainly divided opinions.
Okay. So back to the movie?
Yeah, in the next scene we have a look at one of Lincoln's sepia-toned dreams, where he's on a boat in the night approaching a shoreline, and Abraham and Mary Lincoln, as we mentioned earlier, played by Sally Field, are then seen inside Mrs. Lincoln's White House bedroom discussing the dream and other matters, including the possibility of a new push for a proposed 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. Mrs. Lincoln's against it and thinks, not because she's pro-slavery, but she just thinks it's wasting political capital on a doomed cause.
Let's do a quick reality check. When you're watching the movie, suddenly it becomes this sepia tone thing and you're trying to figure out what's going on here. It takes you a little while to realise that this is a dream or a fantasy sequence. And I thought it was a bit odd to throw it in, and what was the significance of it? Well, on reflection, that very dream they portray in the movie was a recurring dream of Lincoln's. He did have it often, and it was about a boat approaching some sort of endless shore, and apparently he had that every night before a major battle, which the North won. So whenever he did have this dream, it seemed a good omen for him.
Right.
So setting the scene on that 13th Amendment that comes up for the first time in the movie, after the loss of much lives at the Battle of Antietam, which was won by the Southern General Robert E. Lee, Lincoln decided to change the stakes of the war and make it about freeing the slaves, whereas previously it had simply been about rejoining the Union, getting the rebels to come back into a single United States. This would enable, freeing the slaves in the South, would enable 190,000 free black men and escaped slaves to join the army, the Union Army. However, presidential proclamations, which is what he used, it wasn't an act of parliament, it was just a proclamation, can be overturned if you get another president coming in, and that's what we're finding these days with Trump. He's turning over some presidential proclamations that Obama had put in, so it's a fairly shaky strategy in the long run. And so Lincoln wanted not just legislation to keep the slaves free, but he wanted a permanent amendment to the US Constitution, which is a very, very difficult thing to achieve.
Yeah, they need a 2/3, 3/4 majority.
They need 3/4 majority of the states or the state legislatures to ratify it, and they need 66% of the people in the Congress to agree to it as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, certainly it was, and I only found this out recently. Robert E. Lee, who's seen as the darling of the South during the during the Civil War, and was certainly a very, very effective general. He'd been offered command of the Union armies by Lincoln when he first took office, before the war started, and he declined.
And apparently Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee studied together at West Point. Both graduated around about the same time.
Okay, back to the movie. President Lincoln leaves Mrs. Lincoln, walks down the hallway and lays down with his sleeping son, Tad, played by Gulliver McGrath, in his White House office before carrying his youngest son off to bed. Tad had been looking at some gruesome photo negatives of brutalised slaves. Now we're doing quite quick jumps from movie to reality here, but it's a strange little scene, but I think just showing the human side of Lincoln.
Yes, because he lies down in front of the fire with his son, he hugs him and carries him off to bed and realises that Tad has been looking at these images, and that, I guess, shows us Tad's sensitive side as well. And
he did prove to be
a sensitive soul. That's definitely true. But the historians do say it's very unlikely that the president would have let his son play with these very delicate and potentially dangerous glass negatives of the day.
Yeah. The next scene is a brief flagpole dedication, a very short Lincoln speech, and then a carriage ride where there's a discussion between Lincoln and his Secretary of State, William Seward, who we mentioned.
One of his rivals.
Yeah, had been and was now his right-hand man, played by David Strathairn. And Lincoln and he discussed the prospects for passage of the 13th Amendment. Military aide John Hay, played by Joseph Cross, is shown shuffling papers. We then see Lincoln and Seward continue their discussion when a Mr. and Mrs. Jolly from Jefferson City, Missouri, brought into Lincoln's office, and Seward uses the couple to illustrate a point about the 13th Amendment. Mainly that the common people are interested in freeing slaves if it will end the war, but only for that reason. They're not really interested in altruistic reasons or deep principle reason. So next we see Lincoln and Francis Preston Blair, played by Hal Holbrook, discussing the 13th Amendment and also the possibility of opening peace negotiations with Richmond, which is the capital of the South. Also present are two of Blair's children, Montgomery Blair, who was former Postmaster General,
that's right,
played by Byron Jennings, and Elizabeth Blair Lee, played by Julie White. Tad Lincoln's present, and afterwards Preston Blair leaves for Richmond to take a message, basically offering discussions.
Yeah. So
negotiations.
So let's do a quick reality check on that. So in this short, so far in the short run of the film, we've had, I think, 4 separate conversations about the 13th Amendment.
Yeah.
Right, with Lincoln's wife, and then Seward, and then Mr. and Mrs. Jolly, and now Preston Blair. So it's clearly a big deal. It's going to be a big part of the movie, if you hadn't guessed that already.
Yeah.
As we've already mentioned, that William Seward was indeed Lincoln's Secretary of State throughout his entire presidency, both terms. Originally expecting, as we say, to be nominated as the presidential candidate for the new Republican Party, he was beaten by this inexperienced hick lawyer from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln. It was a shock to those following politics, and mostly so to Seward himself. More shock followed because, surprisingly, Lincoln would be elected president of this brand new Republican Party, would become president of the States. He immediately nominated Seward to the important position of Secretary of State, and to his credit, Seward accepted, and by 1865, when the movie is set, he saw Lincoln as one of the greatest American presidents and saw him as the only man that could save the Union.
Yeah, I guess no one would have been canvassing the public to sway the argument for pursuing the amendment. It was the politicians he needed. Lincoln had made his mind up and had said so publicly, so everybody knew where he stood. And the Republican Party, he basically managed to lock them in on it.
That's right. So Mary saying, don't pursue the amendment, you're wasting capital in a new presidency. Mr. and Mrs. Jolly trying to convince him whether he should or shouldn't trust the public on this. It was already a done deal. He mentioned it in his second inauguration speech.
Yeah.
And he'd also said it publicly in the presidential campaign in the lead up to November the previous year. So they're playing with that a little bit, creating some tension, as Hollywood likes to do.
Yeah. Francis Preston Blair, who was sent down to Richmond to speak to Confederate President Jefferson Davis, although Lincoln wouldn't dignify him with that title, because he said, this is not two nations, you're secessionists, you're not a country. But Blair was sent quietly to go and offer the prospect of negotiations. He'd been twice, I believe, Lincoln had sent him, and his house was across the road from the White House.
Blair House?
Yeah, and you were saying that it's still there today.
We saw it in October a little while ago in 2016, and it's now converted. They've taken over the two houses either side of it, I think, and so it still shows as Blair House.
Yeah.
But it's now owned by the government, and it's where the dignitary stays. So Tony Blair stayed in Blair House when he was in Washington, typically. Yeah. Yeah, so, okay, shall we go back
Gordon Brown was probably sent to a small B&B downtown somewhere.
Maybe. Won't comment.
So, back to the movie. Next morning we see Lincoln at a cabinet meeting, and they're discussing an attack on Fort Fisher and Wilmington, North Carolina. Then again we see a discussion of the 13th Amendment, and there's vigorous objections from Secretary of the Interior John Usher, played by Dorkin Matthews, and Lincoln disagrees, and he launches into a lengthy defence of the proposed amendment, just saying, look, any emancipation policies that I put forward can easily be overturned after the war. This has got to be an amendment to the Constitution.
Lock it in.
And then it's absolutely locked in. And then Lincoln, Seward and Congressman James Ashley discuss it further, talk about bringing it up for a new vote because it had already failed once. Ashley objects and seems terrified, but Lincoln and Seward stand their ground. But you do get a feeling the way they're having to wheel and deal.
Joel, yeah.
And then we meet in the Capitol building. We meet for the first time Republican Representative Thaddeus Stevens, played with wonderful charm by Tommy Lee Jones. He's another of those incredibly watchable character actors, definitely. Stevens is chairman of the important Ways and Means Committee, and currently is hosting a meeting of radical Republicans, because they are, fervent abolitionists. They believe slavery must end on moral grounds. It's a vigorous debate, especially about Lincoln's intentions. And you get the feeling that Thaddeus Stevens is a sometime rival and a sometime adversary and sometime supporter of Lincoln, depending on if he feels Lincoln is going his way. But he's also obviously a very, very important figure.
Yep.
We also see these three. It's like the three goons, not goons in a mocking way, but like the
lovable goons, like the Three Stooges or something.
Well, I was thinking they're like enforcers. They're the guys who do the dirty work that the politicians mustn't be seen to do.
That's true, but they do it with a certain sense of humour and wit.
James Spader playing William Bilbo is wonderful. He really, really did play the part well, I thought. Robert Latham, played by John Hawkes, Richard Schell, played by Tim Blake Nelson, and William Bilbo, as we said, played by James Spader.
And they're being instructed by Seward, aren't they, to do some skullduggery to get the vote across.
And basically, they can't meet Lincoln. His hands can't be sullied, but the Secretary of State, that's not a problem. And they're talking about persuading, possibly bribing, selected lame duck Democratic congressmen into supporting them in the 13th Amendment, because they realise they need a certain amount of either abstentions or votes in favour
from the opposition Democrats from the bases down south. Even though there's northern Democrats, most of them elected from the south, and they're very pro-slavery as a party generally.
Yeah.
Shall we try and unpack that?
Yeah, the reality on that, and we don't need to go into nitpick detail, but certainly because we don't know the actual dialogue, if it's accurate or not. Obviously, these conversations like this were not recorded for everyone's protection. But yeah, Thaddeus Stevens, real character, and
he was the head of the Ways and Means Committee, and he would go on to, and then that congressman that was terrified of introducing the bill to the floor, Ashley, he would indeed go on to introduce the amendment to the House. Lincoln was able to convince him that it was time to do it.
Or he was more scared of Lincoln and Stevens than he was of the repercussions.
And it's true that we mentioned this, that the amendment had already passed the Senate. So the upper house had already passed it. So again, that concept of, are we going to do it? Shall we convince Lincoln to do it? Shall we get him to not do it? All that tension, including with Thaddeus Stevens trying to convince the radical Republicans it's time to do it. That happened, but it happened in the previous year at the very least,
right,
because everyone knows that the Senate has passed it. Lincoln said he's going to do it in his speeches, and they're taking again, like we said in the past, they're compressing a couple of years' worth of events into this one key month of January when the arguments are going. What about those lovable lobbyists that reappear in the film doing lots of funny little things to convince people to join the movement?
Well, they were all active Republican loyalists, and they were all active in Washington at the time, although we wonder if their actions as shown in the movie are possibly a little bit exaggerated. Or maybe there were a couple of dozen people messengers who'd go out and persuade these lame duck Democrats, and they just compressed it into 3 characters. Otherwise, it's a massive cast and it's very expensive.
Perhaps.
I'm not sure.
They were, as you say, real Republican stalwarts.
Yeah.
And they did work their way up through the ranks. They were all successful businessmen. They were all successful businessmen or lawyers by this time.
Yeah, because they sort of come across as carpetbaggers a bit, don't they?
That's right.
Sort of like travelling ruffians.
That's right. And they would have done, if anyone had done any of this sort of skullduggery, it might have been in the previous election. It might have been for the 1860 election. These guys were too reputable to be doing this sort of stuff, but there is a suggestion that they might have done it in the past. And we say that they were known in Washington at the time. The reality is that they were Washington operatives, but to try and convince people that they should vote for the 13th Amendment, the best way they could do that was convincing the journalists and the lawyers and the opinion makers in New York and Philadelphia. And that's where they were trying to get some of these Democrats to turn. I think the greatest number of turned Democrats came from New York and Philadelphia because of the efforts of these 3 lobbyists to try and sway public opinion as well as a few Democratic politicians.
Right. Because next we go to the House of Representatives, and this is where many of the key scenes of the movie take place. And we see a Northern Democrat. He's pro-slavery but doesn't live in a seceding state. In one example, Fernando Wood, played by Lee Wood, just a coincidence on the name, from New York, versus the radical Republicans such as Thaddeus Stevens, played by Tommy Lee Jones. I mean, Fernando Wood is an absolute slimeball. He's just, God set us above the black man and all this sort of
We're not supposed to like him and we don't.
No. And he's clever, but you just wait for the Thaddeus Stevens put down, and we get plenty of them, which is very rewarding. And we also see the Seward lobbyist, the James Spader and his buddies, sat up in the gallery, and there's Mary Lincoln and other people, and they're discussing, and the 3 lobbyists are discussing who they might target, and they're basically watching the faces
of all the Democrats,
going, well, he doesn't look convinced, he's not exactly enthusiastic. So, as we said earlier, we needs a majority of 66% and then 75% of the state legislatures. Historians critical of the diet discussions and the insults shown in the House scenes. They're thinking it wouldn't have happened like that.
Yeah, we get these great put-downs face-to-face of the different politicians being called lizards and less than human and stuff like that. But then, as in now, no member of Parliament in either the Australian Parliament, the UK Parliament, or the American Parliament would direct any conversation like that to one of their colleagues.
It's always to Mr. Speaker or
It's
Mrs.
through the
Speaker.
Speaker. They say, Mr. Speaker, do you realise so-and-so is a lizard or something like that? They would never say, you're the lizard.
I would suggest that.
Yes. And one thing that we did miss was that together with Mary Lincoln in the gallery, we see an image of her black dressmaker / confidant, Elizabeth Keckley, played by Gloria Reuben.
Oh, sorry, I missed that.
And the historians have pointed out that there are several scenes where both these ladies are in the gallery, and they almost certainly never happened. They would have been welcome to come, but it would have been quite a scene, I guess, with the First Lady coming like that. There is some significance in suggesting that a black dressmaker / friend of Mary Lincoln is in the gallery, and she obviously feels fairly alone up there with all the white faces around her in the movie. And there were occasional black people that came to the gallery, so it's not unheard of and not that shocking. But it makes for good Hollywood.
Back to the movie, and we meet Robert Lincoln, who's sort of college age, young man, and he is messing around with his younger brother Tad, and he's come back from Harvard, and the corridor in the White House is absolutely full of petitioners wanting to see the president. And then Robert talks to his mother. He says he wants to enlist, and classic story through the ages, young man, I want to do my part. Mother's absolutely reluctant to let their child put themselves at risk, and he's very unhappy, and he's saying, look, people are going to accuse me of being a coward, using my
hiding behind
name.
the presidency.
Yeah, exactly. So he tries all day to see his father, but Abraham Lincoln is focusing on finishing a discussion with Preston Blair, who's just come back from Richmond. And then we see a series of snapshots with the Seward lobby, Latham, Shell and Bilbo, in action, cajoling, offering bribes, threatening people. Yeah, you're going to get this job. If you only abstain, then you'll be a postmaster somewhere on the frontier.
But even the postmaster jobs, I think, were a bit of a carrot, because I think
they had lucrative.
They had some say in the collection of taxes, I think.
Yeah. And in truth, for a quick reality check, Robert Lincoln was desperate to enlist, wasn't he?
Played by Joseph Gordon-Levitt in the movie.
And eventually, I believe he did
convince the parents to let him. Yeah, we'll come to that later, I guess. But he was pleading with his parents to let him enlist. And while the words discussed in the movie, we have no idea whether they obviously are a work of writers, they do portray his frustrations of not being able to enlist. He was old enough to do so voluntarily. So he didn't need his parents' permission, but he wanted their blessing. Later on in the movie, we see that he was successful, and it shows that Lincoln asks if his son could become a soldier in Ulysses S. Grant's entourage. So he would be an adjunct or an aid to the most important general in the war. So would clearly almost certainly be removed from the front lines. That's right. So guarantee him some sort of sense of...
Yeah, because Mary Lincoln is furious with Abraham, isn't she? She certainly seemed quite a willful and crazy lady.
That's right.
Maybe not crazy, that's a bit harsh.
Now, we mentioned the term about the lame ducks, and it is a bit hard to get your head around. We've had the election in November, and here we are in January. The people that lost their seats or won re-election to their seats are still meeting in January and possibly even February or March. The people that get elected in November, especially back then, didn't take their seats until March, I believe.
Right.
And
this is one of the reasons they've said, isn't it, why he was trying to push it through before the new Congress sat.
There's lots of speculation on the reason.
The people who were leaving Congress, who've been voted out.
And who've been voted out, right? They still had legislative power, just like they did before the election, but they know that they'd lost their jobs. They weren't going to be representatives anymore.
When you say, we could make you Postmaster General here, or ambassador to Rome there, it's quite lucrative and attractive.
But it does raise the issue, why didn't he wait until March or April, when they would have the numbers apparently, because the Republicans did very well in the election of 64. Why didn't he wait?
One of the things I read of the reason he pushed it, this was an article, I think it was the Washington Post or the Smithsonian or something. So
something reputable.
Should have some credibility. Was saying that he knew that within his own party there was a smallish group, but enough, who would vote against him, not because they didn't believe in it necessarily, because they didn't like him still. The Conservative Republicans are referred to in the movie.
Well, there is...
And he starting a 4-year term as congressman, they didn't feel the pressure.
Yeah.
Because they're thinking, well, he's not going to last more than another term. We'll see the back of him.
Well, the other thing in the movie, I think they accurately portray the fact that he used a wartime proclamation to free the slaves, and he discussed it as like liberating some property. He treated them like wartime property, and it was a wartime. And of course, the war is still going, but it's going very well for the North. And there is a concern that the war will end before he gets the amendment through.
Yeah, he was saying that it's a commodity that will aid and abet the enemy, because the South used a lot of black slaves to
progress the war, do the
auxiliary troops and labour troops and stuff like that. Yeah, they are a commodity that's assisting the war effort. Therefore, it's legitimate for me to deny them to the enemy.
So the ending of the war
finishes,
they might revert back to they're not what's the word, commandeered property. They go back to the original owner. So he's trying to juggle a lot, and he's taking a bit of a risk by getting all these Democrats to turn and vote for him. But that's the tension of the movie.
Then we see the President and Secretary Seward discussing the state of the lobbying efforts. Seward reveals his anger that the President decided to authorise peace negotiations without consulting him.
Using Blair to Virginia.
Because Seward hadn't known about it. And in the next scene, we see the negotiating team that had been sent from the Confederate side arriving at General Grant's headquarters and being stared at by a lot of very effective, smartly turned out black soldiers, Union soldiers, and you can see the glares between the two groups. And
it's a great scene.
Yeah, very, very well done.
However, in reality, the historians all seem to agree that given the role of the black soldiers in the war for the North and the nature of Ulysses S. Grant's entourage, there would have been no such black faces to greet the shocked Confederates that were shown in the movie. So nice Hollywood license.
Considering what we covered in Glory, where the 54th Massachusetts were very much fighting troops. But
just reflecting what I read.
Sure.
And the scene earlier that you mentioned about Blair and Seward, where Seward was so upset about the clandestine approach to the South, that apparently is true. Seward and Blair were great rivals and political enemies, even though they were both Republicans, and yet Lincoln was friends and with both of them, seeking advice from both of them as well.
Yeah, that's always difficult, the three-way relationship where A likes B and C, but B and C can't stand each other.
That's a classic.
And when A's in charge, that takes some delicate leadership. Back to the movie, a couple of days later, it's January the 14th, and we see Tad and Robert, the sons, in Lincoln's bedroom whilst the President dresses for a grand reception. Robert's still trying to push his father to allow him to serve in the military. And then Tad, the younger brother, has a frank discussion with the three black servants, William Slade and Elizabeth Keckley, about slavery. And then the President walks down and finds his wife Mary sitting alone in their dead son Willie's former bedroom. Because Willie died, was it an illness or a hemorrhage or something?
One of them died tuberculosis, and the earlier there was Eddie.
Probably from typhoid fever. Yeah.
The earlier son, Eddie, he died in 1950 before the 1960 election, obviously.
1850.
1850, thank you.
Yeah, and we think from TB, yeah. Then we go to the White House reception. Mary Lincoln is cautiously greeting the leading radicals and engages in a fairly tense exchange with Thaddeus Stevens. They obviously don't see each other as...
they die?
No. And then in the kitchen, Lincoln and Seward are discussing the amendment tactics. And Thaddeus Stevens talks disparagingly of his electorate. Basically, they're idiots. They'll just go with whatever they think.
Yeah.
Or sorry, not with. They won't think about it. They'll just go with whoever.
Whatever I say.
Yeah.
So let's just do a quick reality check there. As we mentioned, they had two sons that had died. Eddie when they were still in Illinois, and then Willie who died while they were in the White House. And Mary and Lincoln did grieve because I think it's true that they were at a reception when their son died or fell ill and was hospitalised, and so they're feeling guilty now because they're going to a reception. So that's quite believable under the circumstances in which he died, and obviously his bedroom's untouched.
One thing I skipped over actually was that the conflict between Mary and Thaddeus Stevens seems to have been, he'd been asking some fairly
Pointed questions
about White House expenses and how much they'd spent on her costumes and jewellery and new curtains and things.
She had a reputation for having, she owed a lot of money. She would trade off the fact that she was the president's wife and turn up to lots of dress shops and buy dresses on credit and not pay them, and she felt the pressure of having to be the first lady, don't you know, and would was pretty profligate in her spending, and there were questions from the Ways and Means Committee about the level of spending for the White House. But everyone says there's no way known in such a polite society setting that anybody would have challenged anybody at a gala like this.
Yeah.
If they did have crosswords at all, it would have been in private and not in public like this.
I'm thinking of that very quickly, just as a relevant aside, a lovely story about Jack Charlton when he was manager of the Irish football team. Jack was one of the Charlton brothers who were in the World Cup winning squad for England in the 60s.
Okay.
And in the 80s into the 90s, he was Ireland manager, and he'd go into an Irish bar and buy everyone in there a drink, and they'd all think, oh, wow, what a guy, because they loved him anyway because he was successful, he was a real character. But then he'd say to the landlord, is a cheque all right? So of course he'd sign it now, and it's never going to be cashed because this guy's like, I've got Jackie Charlton's signature, and he'd put it in a glass frame above the bar. Awesome. So Jack Charlton used to go yeah, and he's got a reputation for being a bit canny, so maybe Mary Lincoln should have done that. Anyway, sorry, I digress.
No problem.
Back to the movie.
We see Help. The Help undress Mary after the reception, but they're interrupted by news at the end of the reception, brought to them by their aide, John Nicolay, that the important assault on Fort Fisher outside Wilmington, North Carolina, has begun. So the action then quickly moves to the War Department telegraph office. There's all sorts of commotion and anxiety apparent in the telegraph office as we see Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, played by Bruce McGill, Secretary of Navy Gideon Wells, played by Granger Hines, and a telegraph officer discussing this real-time assault on Fort Fisher. Suddenly, we see a seated President Lincoln. He interrupts the exchange with a funny story. So all this tension, and all of a sudden Lincoln's in the room, we realise, the same night, and he interrupts the exchange with a funny story about Ethan Allen that appears to relieve some of the tension until news finally arrives that the Union forces have prevailed at the fort, though not yet at the city of Wilmington, and to the cost of yet another round of bloody casualties.
It was right after the Revolution, right after peace had been concluded, and Ethan Allen went to London to help our new country conduct its business with the king. The English sneered at how rough we are and rude and simple-minded and on like that everywhere he went, until one day he was invited to the townhouse of a great English lord. Dinner was served, beverages imbibed. Time passed, as happens, and Mr. Allen found he needed the privy. He was grateful to be directed thence. Relieved, you might. Now, Mr. Allen discovered, on entering the water closet, that the only decoration therein was a portrait of George Washington. Ethan Allen done what he came to do and returned to the drawing room. His host and the others were disappointed when he didn't mention Washington's portrait, and finally his lordship couldn't resist and asked Mr. Allen had he noticed it, the picture of Washington he had. Well, what did he think of its placement? Did it seem appropriately located to Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen said it did. His host was astounded. Appropriate? George Washington's likeness in a water closet? Yes, said Mr. Allen, where it'll do good service. The whole world knows nothing to make an Englishman shit quicker than the sight of George Washington.
The action then moves to the floor of the House, so it must be the next day, and we see Democratic Congressman George Yeaman, played very well by Michael Stolberg of Kentucky, announcing to the House that he plans to oppose the anti-slavery amendment, because although he's thoroughly abolitionist, uncharacteristically of a Democrat, he believes that the US can't handle an extra 4 million freed slaves overnight, while some of the Seward lobbyists plot ways to switch his vote from their perch in the gallery.
Yeah.
The next day, we see one of the lobbyists hunting with one of the congressmen that's trying to turn, a character by the name of Clay Hawkins, played well by Walton Goggins. Clay Hawkins is from Ohio, and he and the lobbyist are discussing a possible deal. Hawkins seems spooked by some threats against him and literally starts to run away from the deal while James Spader's Bilbo is chasing him, trying to argue and get him to turn.
It's a bit Keystone Cops, isn't it?
It's
quite
fun,
funny,
though.
that one, yeah.
Finally, we see the three lobbyists confronting Secretary of State Seward in his carriage, explaining that they haven't been able to make enough progress. Then there's a quick cutaway showing how one of the congressmen tried to shoot Bilbo, James Spader, outside a tavern. That again is very Keystone Cops. Then we see the lobbyists trying to convince Seward that the president needs to deny some rumours that there are some secret peace talks going on somewhere, and that's ruining their ability to turn the Democrats for some reason.
And that sets a scene for a key piece later on, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The thing about they're hearing that there might be secret peace talks going on as rumours.
That's right. We'll return to that.
So back to reality. Certainly Fort Fisher would have been extreme. We don't know if Lincoln and half the cabinet went to the telegraph office, but he was famous for telling these funny little anecdotes, wasn't he?
To relieve the tension.
Yeah.
He's seen as some tall, serious, sombre man in a public image, but in reality he was quite the vagabond, and he loved telling anecdotes, particularly the one that they use in the movie about an American delegate, Ethan Allen, when he went to England not long after the Revolutionary War, and the story he tells in the movie is one of his favourites, so maybe we can drop it in about here.
Yeah, we'll drop that little clip in.
About George Yeaman, the Kentucky congressman played by Michael Stahlberg, that's all pretty correct. Kentucky was a border state and never really joined the Confederacy. However, even though it was from the north, it was a slave-owning state. However, by the time of the movie, 75% of its slaves had escaped their owners, so slavery's days were clearly numbered in Kentucky, regardless of the future of this amendment. But even still, for George Yeaman to come out as a Democrat and say that he was anti-slavery, he was an abolitionist, was a pretty brave move. It might have even been a bit braver if he decided to actually support the 13th Amendment. The Clay Hawkins character, who runs away from James Spader, is not a real person, but he does sort of show how many retiring Democrats might have been thinking about offering some sort of plum job or some other enticement. There is some dispute as to how much bribery actually took place at this time to sway some votes. So there were rough and tumble times, but maybe they weren't as free with the cash as they show here. A job's one thing, but cash might be beyond the pale, as some of the historians suggest.
Yeah. I'm sure the people who didn't like the result of the vote when it eventually comes would say it was all done by bribery and skullduggery, and those who don't would like it to all be upstanding and honourable.
Yeah.
I mean, we've mentioned already, if a peace were to happen before this gets put through, then, as we said, all his work might have been undone.
Yeah, the property.
So back to the movie, we're now January the 20th, 1865. So this is a fairly short space of time, all this is happening.
Yeah, it's pretty much all the whole action
And
so far is in the month of January.
Outside City Point, Virginia, is that?
Yeah.
Yeah. On board the River Queen steamship, General Grant negotiates with the Confederate officials, immediately saying to Vice President Alexander Stephens, who's leading their lobby, he says, right, these references to two countries, they're going to have to go. He said, Lincoln will not countenance any mention of two countries. You're not a country, you're secessionists. So there's a bit of a
putting them in
an argument,
box.
And very quickly, that's absolutely true, isn't it?
It is.
Grant.
It certainly is.
And Grant certainly went on to show he was a politician as much as he was a great general.
Yeah, he was elected to office after the war, and he actually got re-elected, although there is talk that he was a pretty poor president. Someone's tried to redeem that now, but he for a long time has had a reputation as a very poor president despite being re-elected.
Then we see Grant sends Lincoln a telegram urging him to meet the Confederate envoys himself, and then at the White House, at the Seward House, we have them, Lincoln and Seward discussing what they should do next. And then obviously Abraham Lincoln pacing in his office, lost in thought, really trying to work out how
to proceed.
How to proceed best.
With the delegates and the peace talks and the amendment, which comes first. So now back to the movie. We're in the War Department telegraph office again the next morning. Lincoln now has wandered over to the telegraph office himself, still covered in his shawl from the night before, where he's finishing a draft reply to General Grant's telegraph. And he instructs Grant to bring the Confederate envoys to a location in Virginia called Hampton Roads.
So not far from Washington.
Not far from Washington, but he seems on board to try and do two things at the same time. One, negotiate for peace with some delegates from the South, somehow, either in person or through proxy. And two, at the same time, try and push through this 13th Amendment with the lame duck Democrats.
Yeah. Then, back in the House of Representatives, Thaddeus Stevens, the Tommy Lee Jones character, prepares to take the floor. Democratic congressmen try and bait him into making firebrand remarks, probably because he had in the past, and that they basically want him to say, we must free all slaves now, because all men are equal, and he has said this sort of thing before.
That's right. He says the blacks are equal to us, which is radical to a lot of people. You might
they were then, yeah.
You might want to free them, but don't say that they're equal to us.
Knowing how much damage it will do, and people who might be swaying might go, oh, hang on, that's a step too far. I don't mind freeing them from slavery, but don't say they're the same as me. Which is really distasteful even to say now in a critical tone, but Stephen surprises everybody again. No. What I said is all men should have equality before the law.
Which is a slight variation to his previous line.
The Democrat goes absolutely potty trying to, no, you dissemble, sir. You've said this before. You must, and he's desperately trying to get him to say it again, and starts to damage himself, I think, by looking so desperate. And Stevens realises this is working.
Yeah, it is, and Stevens has that great sort of approach where he turns to his opposition and says, do I think you're my equal? No way, sir. You are a cur or a lizard or something. But should we both be equal before the law if we're accused of anything? Certainly we should. And he wins the day, doesn't he?
Something like, in fact, I'll tell you what, we'll dig out a clip of that one.
How can I hold that all men are created equal when here before me stands stinking the moral carcass of the gentleman from Ohio, proof that some men are inferior, endowed by their maker with dim wits, impermeable to reason, with cold, pallid slime in their veins instead of hot red blood. You are more reptile than man, George, so low and flat that the foot of man is incapable of crushing you.
How dare you!
Even you, Pendleton, who should have been gibbeted for treason long before today, even worthless, unworthy you ought to be treated equally before the law. And so again, sir, and again, and again, and again, I say, I do not hold with equality in all things, only with equality before the law.
Also in this scene, in the House, again we see Mary Lincoln watching for the gallery in admiration of Stevens's behaviour, but her black dressmaker, Elizabeth Keckley, despises the nature of the debate because they're just all, even Stevens has admitted that blacks may not be equal to whites just to win the argument. Stevens controls his tongue, but he hurls insults at his Democratic opponents, and then outside the chamber, one of Stevens's colleagues, another Republican, he says how disappointed he was that Stevens took this particular sophistry way to sort of weasel word his way to not offending anybody. Stevens, though, he clearly believes he has tread a careful path and he's helped save the future of the amendment by doing this slight verbal compromise.
He's a politician, it's what they have to do sometimes.
Very good at it.
I mean, in reality, we don't know exactly the machinations that went on behind leading up to that speech. We do know Thaddeus Stevens did say the equal before the law line versus all people are equal, but it wasn't on the floor of the House, I believe, and he'd said it a bit earlier. And the bit about the wrestle in Lincoln's mind about whether to bring the Confederates in for conversation about peace, the conversation with the telegraph operators, I imagine, is fictional, but he would have wrestled with it, but he did tell, as the movie suggests, that let's bring the Confederate delegates somewhere close by in northern Virginia. Yeah. Then the next scene, it's the next day, and at a temporary army hospital in Washington, the president takes his son Robert, the young man who wants to join the army, to visit wounded soldiers. Robert suspects it's just so to try and put him off, thinking he might become one of them. And he says you're not scared of me getting killed, you're just scared of Mama. And President Lincoln slaps him, and they have a bit of a Barney. And then back in Mary's bedroom, we learn that actually Abraham Lincoln has decided to let Robert join the army, and she's now furious, and he has to sort of beat a hasty retreat. And then, poignantly, the Lincolns attend the opera that evening to see a performance of Faust. I mean, the reality there, we think that's probably cooked up to show Robert's continuing desire to
join, to enlist.
Yeah.
But in reality, with the scene where he slaps his son, everyone decries that as just going too far.
Out of character. Yeah.
Not only would he have never slapped any of his children, he would never have done so in public. And in fact, there's lots of suggestions that the Lincolns were very bad at disciplining their children. They were a loving, generous couple, and they let their children do whatever they want, which is portrayed in the movie earlier when Robert first appears and there's all his petitioners in the hallway. Suddenly Tad, the younger son, barrels past on a wagon being drawn by a goat inside the White House with no sanction at all.
I did read that the law offices that he'd worked
in Illinois,
when Robert was a young boy, and the older boys, probably the ones who died, I guess, when they were young kids, in Illinois, they used to come into his office and run riot. His partners would say, "Can you please remove your children?" He's like, "Why ever would I do that?"
Yeah, it's.
He just found it a strange idea not to have children playing around.
It would have been a controversial scene for the writers to put him slapping his son, especially as there's no evidence that it happened. And it does go against the grain of the avuncular.
Strange one.
Anyway, moving on.
And then we have Elizabeth Keckley, the black seamstress who worked for Mary Lincoln. She speaks to the president. She'd been to the opera with them, and he's asking her, are you worried about freedom? And she says, no, we want freedom first. We'll worry about social and economic prospects because, as he points out, we free everybody and they're suddenly without...
Unemployed, free people with no means of support at all.
And then... Finally, we see in this series of scenes, we see the exhausted lobbyists who've been around trying to persuade all these Democrats in a hotel room, and Seward enters with Abraham Lincoln with him, and they're like, "Oh,
the president?"
Yeah, and then it's a lovely line. Bilbo says, the James Spader character, he says, "It's hard to bribe people when your face is on the 50-cent piece." And I think he swears at that point.
Yeah, he does. I think the president uses the F word at this stage.
But the 50-cent piece bit, pithy though it is, it's not correct,
not
is it?
True, no.
So what's the reality on that?
Well, he didn't appear on any currency until 4 years later, when his face would appear on the $100 bill, for heaven's sake. And from what I've read, Lincoln would never have talked about bribes openly like this, and he certainly would never have used the F word. So they're taking a bit of a licence in these recent scenes.
Yeah. Back to the movie.
And just one more thing. We mentioned that the three lobbyists were all connected to Washington. They were well known in the Democratic Party. They all would have known Abraham Lincoln. And they would
Republican Party.
Republican Party, thank you. And they would not have been shocked and surprised to be in the same room as him.
No. So back to the movie, and we see Thaddeus Stevens' office at night. A nervous Alexander Cothrath comes in and basically says, he's played by Boris MacGyver, and Stevens says to him, if you want to keep your seat, you're going to have to switch your vote in favour of the amendment. And it's explained, which I didn't really understand, how Thaddeus Stevens has the power to have this guy removed.
But
it's something to do with his influence back in their home state, I think.
But see, Cothrath was not... I don't think he was even one of the lame duck Democratic representatives. I think he actually won the election in 1964, from what I recall.
Right.
But the reality, just very briefly, is that he was a real Democratic congressman from Pennsylvania, but he ended up supporting the amendment, and he went on to be re-elected after that as well.
Yeah.
So it didn't do him any harm whatsoever. And Pennsylvania was a slave-free state, and a lot of the Democratic people that turned were from Pennsylvania.
Then we have George Yeaman, who's the Democratic congressman from Kentucky, of course Lincoln's home state, and he's been trying to be persuaded by Lincoln and Seward, or they're trying to persuade him, but we don't really see how that's going to go. And then basically it's a series of discussions as they're trying to persuade people to support it. And I just find it incredible, looking back from here, that there were people who found moral grounds to resist abolishing slavery. But I guess we're going to go through this. Maybe we're just showing our 21st century sensibilities, because we're going to go through this again next time out with In the Heart of the Sea, about the brutality of the whaling industry and
how the black whalers were treated worse than the white whalers.
Yeah,
they had less rations, and
certainly on Nantucket they were all Quakers, so they were pacifists when it came to people.
Yeah, and if you were from Nantucket, you got treated better than others.
Yeah.
Anyway, back to Lincoln.
Yeah, back to Lincoln, and there's this just seemed really out of character to me, where they're having deep discussions with his inner circle and his two aides. Someone's talking about secret peace talks, and Lincoln's getting angry, and he says, I want action now, and then they still seem uncertain about how to obtain the remaining votes, and Lincoln says, I'm the President of the United States, clothed in immense power. Everything I've read about him, everything I knew before we researched this, and certainly everything I've read during the research for this, tells me that that's not at all what his approach would be.
No,
unless it was just a frustration. But
yeah, when there's things are tense in the movie, a couple of times they have him cracking a little joke and telling a funny story. Now things are tense, and he's adding to the tension.
Yeah.
From what I learnt, if he was going to have passionate conversations with his colleagues to try and convince them of the moral force of his argument, it would have been in 1864, before the election. Will we mention in our campaign or not? And so they might have taken again a bit of license, but I think they've taken a lot of license, in fact, in that scene. Okay,
so back to the movie. It's now January the 31st, and this 1865, and this is the day of the vote for the 13th Amendment. And I must admit, this is one scene I felt just dragged on a bit as they went through. The Speaker or the Clerk of the House calling out, how do you vote? And each person would answer, and it just, we've got a number of people, well-to-do black people, and we meet...
In the gallery?
Yeah, up in the gallery, Frederick Douglass.
No, his son, I think.
I wish his son was there, that's right, because he's mentioned, because of course we met him in Glory.
Yes, he was in the movie Glory. He was in real life, he was one of the soldiers in the 54th Infantry from Massachusetts.
Frederick Douglass's son.
Yeah. But the movie Glory doesn't reference that, because they're all fictional.
So the congressman, one congressman welcomes the black guests into the gallery, and then the final statements begin, but the Democratic leader George Pendleton interrupts to say, we've heard there are Confederate peace envoys in the city, and there are calls to postpone the vote, saying, well, if the war's over, if they come to surrender...
That changes everything.
It changes everything. We need to know what's going on. And a Conservative Republican, Aaron Haddam, seeks guidance from Preston Blair, who nods, and he says, the Conservatives cannot support the amendment if a peace offer is being held hostage to its success. So basically they're accusing Lincoln of having a peace offer on the table, but he's keeping it secret to get his abolition of slavery bill through. Right. So then Hay sprints to see Lincoln with Bilbo chasing or following, and Lincoln reads the motion from the House and crafts a response. And Hay is really worried, isn't he? He says, you cannot lie, Mr. President. You cannot make false representation to the House.
So the people in the House have demanded that they get clarification from the President about the status of these peace talks.
Yeah.
He won't appear in the House. He only does that for the State of the Union address. So he's going to write them a note to explain their question. And this is a key scene in the movie.
Absolutely. Back at the House of Representatives, Congressman James Ashley reads Lincoln's response, and he says, the President has sent the following message: there are no Confederate envoys in the city. The Democrats, recognising it as a lawyer's dodge as they describe it, denounce the statement, but the Conservative Republicans say, no, that's good enough for us, the voting may begin.
Yeah.
And then we go state by state, and at the end, Beanpole, Burton, Coffroth, Hutton, Yeaman, Hawkins, and the Speaker himself, who usually doesn't vote, all cast votes in favour. And
so it passes.
It passes. Thaddeus Stevens takes the final bill from the stunned clerk who's just sort of recorded it all and said, I'll return this in the morning. And then he limps home with his dodgy leg, carrying the final bill, presents it to Lydia Smith, his black housekeeper, and
we soon learn
see them they're in bed together and they are in fact lovers.
And she's reading this great bill that will free her.
It's a really
fellow
sweet
blacks.
scene, actually.
It is.
Tommy Lee Jones is just this film has got some absolutely fantastic actors in it.
Sure.
Daniel Day-Lewis, of course.
The cream of the crop.
Yeah.
But just do a quick reality check then. That whole business about having to produce a letter for the Congress so that they convince them that there is no imminent peace talks, that apparently is true. There wasn't a race to get it from him. In fact, remember the Bilbo character is lobbying the press in New York, not even in Washington.
Right.
But the Congress did demand a letter, and he did write that letter. He did write that lawyer's response saying, there is no peace envoy in the city that I know of, and nor do I expect there to be anytime soon. And the reason why that is kind of true is that the peace envoy was...
They were down the river being held by Ulysses Grant.
In Virginia with Grant's campaign.
Yeah, brilliantly done. That is shenanigans, but it's been done for a very noble cause, I think.
And true. Okay, so back to the movie.
Yeah, the Thaddeus Stevens thing. I can't imagine he'd be allowed to take an original copy of an amendment bill home.
No, great movie, great Hollywood scene, but I'm certain it's not true.
And we do believe that his housekeeper Lydia Smith was generally seen as his common law wife.
That's right, they were lovers for sure.
But one of her grandparents had been black.
She was 1/4 black, and that wasn't hidden in any way. So to anyone from the South, she would have been seen as a tainted black person, and but she probably wasn't as dark-skinned as the actress in the movie portrays.
No.
But it's surprisingly true. When you first see that scene, you think a black woman and this congressman But it's more true than not true, that whole scene.
Yeah. Well, how much did his love affair with her persuade him that...
Yeah, that's the suggestion.
These are people just like us, crazy.
He's equal.
I don't mean that us as in you and me, but us as in Thaddeus Stevens and his ilk.
Back to the
movie, and the president arrives at Fortress Monroe in Virginia, or Fort Monroe, to meet with the Confederate representatives and Secretary Seward on board the River Queen. The discussion veers back and forth without resolution. Lincoln will not give in to any of the Confederate demands. He's virtually saying unconditional surrender is what's needed. And then we moved on that was February the 3rd. On April the 3rd, obviously this is after his amendments successfully gone through, we see him in Petersburg, moving on horseback past dead bodies from a very recent battle, and then he's seated with Grant at the general's headquarters, and they discuss surrender terms to the Confederates, and Lincoln says he's never seen carnage like he saw that day. And then we jump another 6 days ahead, and General Robert E. Lee is surrendering to General Grant at Appomattox. Appomattox. That what you said.
Appomattox.
Yeah. Robert Lincoln is present as a junior officer on Grant's staff, so we see he did get his wish to join the army, but Mary Lincoln got her wish to keep him out the front lines. And it's April the 14th, and the President and Mrs. Lincoln having a happy conversation about future travel plans now the war is about to end.
Okay, so let's do a quick reality check on that surrender stuff. And
it's pretty much.
It is, it's correct.
Spot on.
He did go to Petersburg on April the 3rd, as portrayed in the movie. The very, very day that the Petersburg fell to Grant. So he was there to see all that carnage. It had just happened that same day. And he was cheered by... The townsfolk couldn't believe he was there, and everyone came out to cheer him on, especially, of course, the black people of Petersburg.
Yeah.
What about Robert Lincoln being present when this important surrender of the Army of the North Virginia surrenders to Ulysses S. Grant? Well, that's apparently true too. He was witness. He did see the signing of the surrender, the Army of North Virginia. And in fact, he would become the last person alive to say that they had been there to witness it. He died many years later.
I was going to say, what, did someone go around killing everyone?
No,
you mean he
outlived them all. Yeah, that's a better way to put it.
Wow.
And the conversation about, slightly optimistic conversation, finally, that the Lincolns can have, that they can live a normal life and travel now that the war is nearly over. Apparently, I think Mary Lincoln was with him a few days earlier than portrayed in the movie at that St. Petersburg meeting where the blacks cheered him on. And as they're going back to Washington, D.C., they passed a very pleasant little country grove with a cemetery, and he kind of comments, it'd be nice to have a normal life and pass away peacefully and be buried in this lovely place.
Yeah.
Ironic in the movie and ironic in real life.
Yeah, back to the movie. The president's getting ready to go to the theatre, and Congressman James Ashley and the Speaker of the House, Shyla Colfax, are with the president, talking about. He made some recent comments on the possibility of extending suffrage to the now emancipated blacks. And Thaddeus Stevens, they're saying, is furious that Lincoln's qualified the extension of suffrage within certain limits. But the tone of the conversation is quite friendly. And when I saw this movie, it did make me think of the Selma scenes with Lyndon B. Johnson talking to Martin Luther King and saying, look,
give me time.
The time's not right for all of what you want. We need to push this bit through, then that bit through, then that bit through. It's almost like the broad picture politician, Lyndon B. Johnson and Abraham Lincoln, against the focus group, the single focal point politician, the pressure group politician, like
who've
got
one agenda only and will do anything to get it, and that is Thaddeus Stevens in one movie and Martin Luther King in the other. Good analogy.
Thank you. I'll take a bow. There's a performance at Grover's Theatre, we see.
Well,
and this is interesting.
We just missed one key scene, and that's that somebody pops up and says, "Mr. Lincoln, your carriage is waiting," and so we see Lincoln and Mary go down the hall, going out to get in the carriage to go to the theatre. Yeah. And we see young Tad Lincoln, watching a performance. Again at the theatre, so we think, is this the president? No, it turns out it's his youngest son, Tad, on the same evening at a different theatre. Yeah, and then there's an announcement. The performance is interrupted by an announcement that the president has been shot, but at Ford's Theatre, not where we're seeing Grover's. And interestingly, Steven Spielberg and the writers chose not to show John Wilkes Booth actually doing the deed. That's a strange. We're sort of robbed of we're robbed of what we know is coming. We know that Julius Caesar's going to get stabbed by Brutus and his pals, but then not to show it. That's what they've done here. We know that they're going to the theatre. I wonder if in doing that, it's a conscious decision to say, we're showing you things about Lincoln's life and what he achieved, not how a nomarch managed to murder him. Yeah, maybe. And I didn't realise John Wilkes Booth was an interesting character. I just always assumed he was a Klansman. He's a white supremacist Southern Klansman, and he was he was slighted about something, I think. Something about that put him on side with the South. But anyway, we'll get to him in a minute. Yeah. So what about the reality of that? The scene where people are talking before he heads out for the theatre, I guess we'll never know who exactly he spoke to before he headed out. There might be some truth to it, but I couldn't find any evidence of these luminaries in the party were there with him before he went to the theatre. As we've said, as unlikely as it seems, Tad actually was at Grosvenor Theatre that night, as the film shows, and he was watching a performance of Aladdin, which I think they suggest in the movie as well, and he actually did learn about the shooting of his father by an announcement made by the theatre manager. The manager felt he had to make the announcement mid-show because both theatres are in the theatre district of Washington, which isn't that big, and rumours were already spreading fast throughout the audience that Lincoln had been shot. So now back to the final scene of the movie, I guess? Yeah, early next morning we see Peterson's boarding house and a dying president on a bed, and a doctor pronounces him dead at 7:22 a.m. And then the movie ends quite abruptly, but with the flashback to delivering his second inaugural address, so that when he was re-elected. In reality, John Wilkes Booth. Well, he did die he was shot in Ford's Theatre. He did get moved over to a boarding house on the other side of the road, and he did die at 7:22 in the morning, as the movie all shows. Well, he was shot in the head. One bullet in the head, penetrated his brain. He hung on for 10 hours or so, I guess. Yeah, which is quite remarkable. It is, in a way. And then the inauguration address, I guess the only comment I make about this awkwardly plonked in inauguration that had been given earlier, weeks or months earlier, was that the movie starts with a reference to his greatest speech, which is the Gettysburg Address that the soldiers are all familiar with. And it ends with his second greatest speech, which apparently the second inauguration and the Gettysburg Address are on everybody's list of the best speeches of the world, of history, in English at least.
And he's definitely, after doing Eva Peron getting 2.5 million turning out at their funeral, Abraham Lincoln had 7 million.
Bashed their brains
7 million people in the mid-1800s or late 1800s. Mid to late 1800s.
Yeah, we've already mentioned about Booth. Booth managed to get past Lincoln's aid. There was Mary and Lincoln in the royal box, or the equivalent in Ford's Theatre, and there was the American flag draped in front of the box. Booth gets past the aide that was guarding the door. He quickly gets one bullet into the back of Lincoln's head. He leaps from the box onto the stage, but he gets his foot caught in the flag draped outside the box, and he said to his broken his leg on the way down. Common wisdom is that he turned to the audience, and the audience doesn't know whether this is part of the act or not. They're all confused, and he turns to them and says, "Sic temper tyrannis," which is Latin for "thus always with dictators." Although he was a northern actor, Booth was sympathetic with the South, and together with he had two other co-conspirators, they had planned to kidnap Lincoln. And deliver him to the South. Booth, who remember is an actor, and he learns that there was a planned theatre visit by the presidential couple, and he changes his plan at the last minute. He says, "No, I'm going to shoot him," and to make sure that they really implement what is pretty much a coup, the three conspirators are supposed to kill Lincoln, at the same time kill Secretary of State Seward, and kill the Vice President Johnson.
Right.
And the only one that was successful fully is Booth, who got Lincoln, as we know.
Yes, Seward was attacked, wasn't he?
In his house, yeah.
But he survived.
He was disfigured terribly, but he survived. But there was all this chaos in his house.
And then the other guy who was meant to kill Vice President Johnson chickened out.
Just chickened out,
Because I didn't realise till I was reading your research on this that John Wilkes Booth actually stayed free for 12 days.
Yeah, big manhunt.
He was shot and killed.
He died on the run 12 days later. The other male conspirators, 3 other male conspirators, were either handed themselves in or were arrested, and together with the woman that ran the boarding house where they planned a lot of this stuff, a lady by the name of Mary Surratt, all 4 were arrested, and then a couple of months later in July, all 4 were hanged.
Yeah. All the final Confederate armies surrendered in May to June 1865, and the final surrender was in June 1865 when a Confederate warship surrendered in Liverpool. Is that Liverpool, UK?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and apparently, I think I read now, the final, whatever the President Johnson ended up saying, the war is now over, whatever proclamation that wasn't issued until December of 65. So things sort of hung on for a good long while.
And then, of course, he had already planned the Reconstruction, where I know Lincoln had written and said, and his administration carried it on, that if we just completely punish the South, we will breed another generation of rebels, and it's just going to cycle over and over again. Unfortunately, that meant that for nearly 100 years, or in fact, no, for 100 years, the Southern blacks didn't actually gain the benefit, which takes us back to glory and the dreadfully poignant and darkly meaningful conversation between the Colonel and Private Tripp, played by Denzel Washington, when he said, "Nothing's going to change for us, so we'll have freedom." And then Matthew Broderick's character says, "Yeah, but if we lose, then you're definitely not getting anything."
So just maybe back to this funeral and what it meant, funeral procession, what it meant for the public. For 3 weeks, the public mourned as his body made its way back to his home in Springfield, Illinois by train. And it was a very circuitous route. It was exactly the same route that he took to get to Washington for the first time. And they just backtracked, and it wasn't a direct route. It followed the main rail lines.
I think it was Baltimore that he avoided because Pinkerton told him there was a threat to assassinate him.
Okay. Way back then, yeah.
Yeah, that was his first inauguration.
Mary was too grief-stricken to make the journey or even to attend the funeral of her husband, so she stayed behind in Washington. As we've already said, some 7 million people paid their respects along the train journey, and as the coffin stopped in various towns overnight. Lincoln was buried and remains buried at Oak Ridge Cemetery together with Mary and 2 of his 3 sons, Willie, who died at the White House, and as we say, Eddie, who died before his first election in 1850. So apparently they've restored that cemetery lots and lots of times, but all of them are buried in the same place. We've already mentioned that to become ratified, the 13th Amendment still needed to be accepted by at least 75% of the states. Now, 75% of what? 75% of the North, or 75% of the North and the South together?
Yeah.
And the greater the number, the easier it is for them to get to 75%. So they included all of the rebel states. I think there were 14 at one stage, yeah. So the interesting thing that I learned at this point in time is that by April, when he was assassinated of 1865, we've already said that the Senate has passed the amendment,
yeah.
And that's locked in. That one important milestone locked in. Some of the states had already started to pass in January and February. Some states had already passed it. So to argue in January that there's no momentum, are we really going to do this amendment thing? It's a bit of a Hollywood create an artificial tension for the audience.
And that included 9 of the 14 rebel states voted in favour.
By the end of 1865, Johnson had managed to get the amendment through, and they needed 27 states, which they did. And as you've said, out of that 27, 9 of the 14 rebel states were ratified it as they needed to. I
guess when you lose a war, you're discredited. And if the war had been led by political and military leaders who were anti-abolishment, then they're going to, maybe I don't know, but I'm pretty impressed that they got 9 out of the 14 to vote for it.
Everyone could see the way it was going, and I wonder how much, the sacrifice of Lincoln's own life taken away, such a tragedy, might have made people think, what are we really doing? Do we really need to dishonour his legacy by still keeping slavery?
And here, I think, again, we see a bit of realpolitik by President Johnson in 1867, vetoed a bill put forward by Thaddeus Stevens that would put the South under military control with 5 separate regions. Stevens' plan was that states would rebuild their constitutions and legislatures with the full participation of their black citizens, but Johnson vetoed it, probably knowing that, again, this is the Reconstruction, and the price that was paid for it, unfortunately, was by the black populations in the southern states, it seems.
Johnson, history suggests, or the historians think, was way more lenient to the entrenched interests of the whites in the South. And we do see that blacks actually got elected very quickly to the state legislatures. They started getting represented, much to the annoyance of the old stalwarts, the whites that had been elected time after time. But they did get representation, and the blacks did vote. And even, I think, 5 years later, the first black man to Washington Congress was elected as well. So things were changing very quickly. However, as often is the case, because there were still the same constitutions and the same legislatures and the same electorates in the southern states, pretty soon the worm turned, and they found clever ways to reinstitute some of the elements of slavery, like paying sharecropping and some of those other things that we spoke about in Selma. They started to chip away at the black rights by having things like poll taxes and the Jim Crow laws, and the initial progression was wound back, so much so to the point that
it's often been said there are many different ways to enslave someone, and one of the most effective is economically. Like indentured bondsmen, we saw, when Britain was populating the West Indies, and you had slaves working alongside them, or white men who worked their passage from England out there thinking they're going for a new future, and being told, right, well, you owe me for the passage, by the guy who sponsored them out there, so that's 3 years, and at the end of the 3 years he goes, I paid you off. He said, well, you paid me off for the passage, but now you owe me for 3 years board and lodging.
There you go.
What? And you end up never getting out of it.
Well, so I think that wraps up the movie. We've gone through what happened to all the protagonists and the legislation and all that afterwards. So
entertainment.
I loved it. I thought I'd give it 9.
Yeah, I think I'm going to have to give it 9 for the movie.
And history?
Maybe 8. Maybe 8. I really enjoyed it. There was just a couple of scenes I just thought were a little bit clunky, but I'd like to do a little special category here and give 10 to Daniel Day-Lewis. It does not get better. I cannot imagine how you can portray someone better than that. Now, obviously, I've never met Abraham Lincoln, and unless we develop a time machine, I'm unlikely to. That would be useful for us for this show. So if anyone's got a time machine we could borrow, that would be great. Rob Irwin, actually, the Doctor Who podcast, he must have the blueprints for the TARDIS. But being serious for a moment, whether he absolutely nails Lincoln or not, and how is anyone ever going to know, he captured what I feel is the spirit of Lincoln so wonderfully. And Tommy Lee Jones, I could watch him in a film with him, Daniel Day-Lewis and Michael Keaton would
be your
just
ideal movie.
Oh,
well, it might happen. Although
Daniel Day-Lewis now says he's retired, doesn't he?
What about history then? It's pretty good. It's pretty good. It's at least a 7 or an 8 for me.
Yeah. There's time compression. There's a couple of fictional characters used to,
Play avatars of certain politicians.
But again, a bit like Rush.
Even less than Hidden Figures. That conflated 10 years into one summer.
No, I think we can forgive it. Yeah, I know. I'd say being true to the spirit of it, and lots and little details, and it isn't telling any big lies.
No.
And we've had that before. Lots of little truths to hide the big lie, like Tombstone with the Legend of Wyatt Earp, which happened in his own memoir.
Biased memoir, yeah.
I think
this
for me, I think it's got to be 8 for
8 for history,
entertainment, and 8 for history.
For me, 9 for entertainment and 8 for history.
Brilliant.
Well, thanks for your time, guys. Next up, we've got In the Heart of the Sea. About the sinking of the Essex. If anyone's thinking,
if you take the combined critic and audience score on Rotten Tomatoes, it's only 42%. But
In the Heart of the Sea?
Yeah, but on Amazon it gets, I think it's 4.2 out of 5, which is 84. It's a better movie than the critics would have you believe. I'm not quite sure why they're so down on it, but for us it raises some really, really fascinating situations and slightly gruesome in some cases.
As the times
but
were, I guess.
Some talking points to get our teeth into, and that's the second time I've made that pun. For anyone who has seen the film, they'll know.
Yes. We'll go over that in 2 weeks' time, though.
Brilliant.
So thanks for your time, guys. See you next time.
Bye-bye.
Fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. As was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and a lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations